Hello everyone, and welcome to my review for Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader. I'm your host, Colors Fade. I know I'm late to this game, but with the second DLC, Lex Imperialis, on its way, I figured this was a good time to dive in. Rogue Trader has a couple of rough edges, but overall I found it to be a much more enjoyable experience than either of Owlcat's prior offerings, Pathfinder, Kingmaker, and Wrath of the Righteous. I really liked those games, even posting Let's Play series for each one. However, I still found myself frequently frustrated by certain design decisions. Both games suffer from Owlcat's tendency to include too many extraneous systems that tear the player away from the core game loop without adding anything fun to the experience. I don't say this to throw shade at Owlcat, because I know they have a passionate team of developers working on their games. I point this out more as a pretext for showing how far they have come as a game studio. Because when I started playing Rogue Trader, I expected to have a similar experience to those first two games. A fun main game loop punctuated by frustrating and annoying tertiary systems. That's not what happened. Owlcat has learned from their missteps, and as such, Rogue Trader ended up being the most fun I've had playing one of their games. Rogue Trader is my first exposure to the Warhammer 40k universe. I knew it was a grim dark mashup of fantasy and science fiction, primarily designed to sell miniature figurines, but what I did not know is that it's also 100% satire. Now don't get me wrong, I don't have anything against satire, other than the fact that sometimes the target audience completely misses the point and you end up with people thinking Homelander is actually the good guy. No, my problem with satire is just that it's not my favorite way to experience a story. You can imagine my surprise then when I fired up Rogue Trader and saw tech priests offering up binaric prayers to their computers, while inquisitors levied accusations of heresy at anyone who looked at them funny. Religious zealotry permeates every nook and cranny of this world, to the point of absurdity. But it makes sense once you realize this is satire aimed at exposing humanity's greatest follies, and what greater folly has there been than religion? Anyway, once I understood the premise, I laughed and enjoyed it for what it was. But I really wish we could get more party-based RPGs with tactical turn-based combat set in serious sci-fi settings, instead of the fantasy ones that dominate the genre. It seems like whenever a party-based science fiction RPG shows up, it employs third-person real-time combat, like Mass Effect. I find this particular style of third-person combat very clunky when trying to also command the abilities and powers of my teammates. This chaotic gameplay is a huge reason I haven't been able to finish the Mass Effect trilogy. Playing Rogue Trader has only reinforced the idea to me that party-based RPGs are best served by adopting a tactical, turn-based combat system. I wish we had more games like this, because this is as much fun as I've ever had in a tactical, turn-based game. Part of the reason Rogue Trader's combat is so good is because of the rule set. To understand what I mean, we first need to examine some of the problems that occur with other tactical, turn-based rule sets. I have often lamented how much I dislike rule sets like Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder because of the way they handle spellcaster classes, requiring spellcasters to memorize spells and then expend those spell slots during combat creates a sharp divide between the functionality and usefulness of melee characters versus spellcasters. Once a spellcaster uses up all their spell memorizations, they become functionally useless in combat encounters until the next rest, when they can memorize their spells once again. That's a sharp contrast to melee characters, who maintain their combat viability throughout the entirety of a dungeon crawl, since they don't have to recover spells in order to fight effectively. The other big problem with these rule sets is how they handle buffs. This is especially noticeable in the Wrath of the Righteous game, where each character can acquire literally dozens of buffs before entering combat. The process of buffing can take several long minutes, and then the player has to worry about when those buffs wear off, potentially losing their bonuses in the middle of a fight. The whole situation is a constant micromanagement nightmare. The folks at Obsidian understood this problem and set about trying to address it when they created Pillars of Eternity and later Tyranny. Since they weren't beholden to a licensed rule set like D&D or Pathfinder, they were free to create their own rules, and as such they began moving towards talents, abilities, and spells that worked on a per-encounter basis. This, to me, is the ideal way to handle things because it eliminates the need for a lot of pre-fight buffing and it reduces the need for resting in order to recover spells and other abilities. These sorts of per-encounter rule sets allowed Obsidian to give fighters unique abilities that could refresh every fight, making them operate more like their wizard counterparts, and thus making every class in the game function in a similar fashion, thus narrowing the divide between melee fighters and wizards. So you can imagine how elated I was when I started to play Rogue Trader and I learned that every single ability in this game is only available during combat. There is no need to worry about maintaining buffs outside of combat, or worrying that they'll wear off during conversations, or losing spellcasting capabilities between encounters because you had to expend spell slots. Nope. Everything is handled strictly within the confines of the turn-based encounters. Buffs, abilities, talents, attacks, it's all handled during the encounter. This makes for a much more fun combat experience because there's a lot less micromanagement. It not only eliminates all the pre-fight buffing, but it also helps make every character's class viable since everyone in your party is at full power at the start of every encounter. Well, unless they've taken wounds, which is another thing I really like about this rule set. Characters in Rogue Trader have hit points in this game and they're referred to as wounds. As a fight progresses, characters lose their wounds to attacks, like any other game, and if they reach 0, they fall down on the ground. But what makes it different from other games is they don't die, not unless the whole party wipes out. When a fight is over, every character gets up off the mat and all their wounds return to full, meaning you don't have to worry about stumbling into the next encounter with less than full hit points because of the damage you just received in the most recent fight. Instead, characters who suffer extreme damage or fall in combat will suffer traumas, and these traumas can be fresh or old, which affects how easily they are mended. But the key mechanic here is that characters take penalties to their stats based on the type and number of traumas they have. So these do have an effect on their fighting prowess, but they don't affect their overall hit points. To me, this is so much better than diminishing hit points. I can't even begin to describe how much more enjoyable this made dungeon crawling. Of course, none of this matters if there aren't cool dungeons to explore and fun encounters to engage in. And fortunately for Rogue Trader, there are a lot of combat encounters, including several boss fights that are simply a blast. In fact, my only gripe here is that there aren't more big dungeons and more boss fights. To borrow a term from Elden Ring, there are basically 3 legacy dungeons in this game. Big, huge dungeons with multiple encounters and multiple boss fights. Most of the other encounters in the game happen 1 or 2 at a time on smaller maps. Now that's not a bad thing, as all the encounters are really fun to play, but I particularly loved the bigger legacy dungeons and wish the game had more of them. It's really fun to get swept away in these larger locations, and I can only imagine how much better the game would have played and how it would have benefited from having a few more of them. A huge reason why the combat is so enjoyable is because of the depth and diversity of the character builds. Every character begins the game as one of 5 origin classes, and then based on that choice, they can later on choose a second class from a smaller subset meant to complement their first class in a unique way. All the class combinations feel distinct and are really fun to play, and that's part of what makes the game so compelling. That said, when you boil it all down, characters generally fall into one of 2 categories. Either they're a damage dealer, destined to clear the battlefield of foes, or they're a support class, designed to buff the damage dealers and grant them extra turns. Action economy is king in this game, and I have never played anything quite like it, where there were so many opportunities to give my team members bonus turns. It was amazing. It's part of the strategy of this title that I absolutely love. Both support characters and damage dealers come in a lot of flavors due to the myriad class combinations, and there are a number of unique abilities and class features that make playing each of these builds a total blast. As one might expect, with this many classes, abilities, talents, and levels, you will make mistakes leveling up. It's simply impossible in a game of this size with this many classes, talents, abilities, and levels for anyone to get their builds right on the first try. You can, of course, use builds that other players have been kind enough to post to forums or places like YouTube, and I admit, to using Wurglia's builds for a little while in my first playthrough because I felt so lost. Wurglia is king. All of his builds work on unfair difficulty, and he does a great job stepping you through the entire build process. However, the thing about just copying and pasting someone else's build is that personally for me, I don't learn the synergies very well, as if I would have just spent the time myself trying to figure it out. So eventually I had to employ the old Excel spreadsheet and start tracking every single ability, looking for synergies and speccing out my own builds. This process took a lot of time and multiple playthroughs, but I found it incredibly rewarding too because I'm nerdy this way. And I ended up with character builds I really enjoyed playing. Fortunately, it's easy enough to respec in the game, though it can become costly as time goes by, which is why I suggest running a mod like Toybox, since it allows for infinite free respecs, at least until you can put together some solid builds of your own. On top of abilities and talents, there's a treasure trove of gear in this game, and loot acquisition is another area where Rogue Trader shines. So much of the loot is useful and fun. Sure, some of it's niche, and there are times when you might not think a particular item is very useful until you learn a particular ability and how it works, and then the light bulb goes off, and all of a sudden you're thinking about a build just for that piece of gear. But that said, this game has one of the best mixes of classes, talents, abilities, and gear that I have ever seen crammed into a single video game. It's really amazing what Owlcat did here. Character builds and combat comprise a huge chunk of Rogue Trader, but this game is not without its tertiary systems. After all, this is Owlcat. For starters, the player has a ship that is used for space combat, and upgrading and outfitting this ship is just as important as leveling up your characters and acquiring new gear. And since the player is a rogue trader, they have worlds they have to govern, which means completing planetary projects. Some of these projects result in permanent buffs for your character or your ship, while others result in more tangible rewards like weapons or consumables. There are also quests, rumors, contracts, and a faction system that is very smartly implemented. If all of that sounds like a lot, it is, but amazingly, it's implemented in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming. And I say that as someone who has been very vocally critic of the way Owlcat has handled its tertiary systems in their prior games. I really hated the kingdom management system in Kingmaker, and I found the crusade management system in Wrath of the Righteous to be unnecessary and annoying. I know I wasn't the only player to voice such criticisms either, because Owlcat eventually did capitulate on the Crusade management system in Wrath of the Righteous, and they nerfed it with the patch so that every world map encounter could basically be skipped by the player by simply choosing to allow the enemy to flee, thus revealing the Crusade management part of the game to be as unnecessary as we all thought it was. With Rogue Trader, though, there are actually more subsystems than in either of those first two prior games, and yet they all work really well together to create a very interconnected and fulfilling experience. You really do feel like you're a rogue trader, responsible for several worlds, various cities on those worlds, the people who are your subjects, as well as the crew of your ship, your companions, and your relationship with the various factions in the Kronos Expanse. All of the tertiary systems serve to tie all of this together in a cohesive manner, which makes these various aspects of the game feel tangible and important. That they do so without feeling annoying, frustrating, or unnecessary is a credit to Owlcat's design team. They've clearly learned from the mistakes of the past, and I was pleasantly surprised to see the results. As I said before, the setting of Warhammer 40k is completely satire, so I found it difficult to engage with it on a personal level. I don't think it was good or bad, it's just that satire makes it difficult for me to care. What I did have an issue with, however, was the pacing. Rogue Trader is broken up into 5 chapters, and they are not all created equal. The opening prologue is very strong, followed by a brisk first chapter that helps the player get a foothold on all the tertiary systems in the game and introduces you to several companions. And then we dive headlong into a banger of a second chapter that is loaded with encounters, more companions, quests, and a lot of intrigue. But then we arrive at Act 3. Initially, I hated this part of the game because it begins with the trope I despise the most: rob you of all your possessions and force you to go it alone for a while. It's basically the old go to jail quest with a small twist. However, upon my second playthrough, I grew to love this chapter. The worst part is the first 10 minutes. Naked and alone, you're gifted a handgun that is essentially useless at this point in the game. Your whole job is to reach a very specific location on the map. But without any knowledge of how or why to do that, you can end up wasting a lot of time and effort fumbling around with impossible skill checks and getting yourself killed. Why this part of the game wasn't just a very quick cutscene, I will never understand. Fortunately, once you know how the chapter works, it doesn't take long to get your gear back, and then you're diving headlong into the fun part, which is reassembling your team and putting the beat down on several annoying enemies who clearly deserve it. What's nice about this chapter is that it's a break from the game's larger game loop. For a little while, we don't have to worry about our planets, their projects, rumors, factions, ship combat, or any outstanding quests. Not that those things are annoying, because they're not. It's just that it's a lot to deal with for a prolonged period of time, which again is why I liked the 3 large legacy dungeons in this game, because they gave you a break from the larger scope of the game loop and allowed you to focus on the most fun part, which is the combat. Because Chapter 3 gives you a break from the bigger picture, it almost feels like a DLC. And were it not for those first awful 10 minutes or so, I'd consider this a high point of the game. Once we escape and return to the Kronos Expanse for Chapter 4, the game's pacing takes a hit. Chapter 4 is basically the companion quest chapter, and as such it feels a little disjointed. You're kind of all over the map, dealing with everyone's personal quests, many of which have nothing to do with the larger concerns of the galaxy, which makes some of this feel more like busy work and content filler rather than compelling gameplay. Personally, I would have liked to have seen a couple more huge legacy dungeons with storytelling that was focused on the larger threats to the Kronos Expanse rather than the isolated side content quests of my companions. There are exceptions, of course. Pascal has a personal quest that is connected to the main story of the game, and it's fun to do his quest precisely because it has meaning for the overarching narrative. But he's an outlier compared to other companions. By contrast, Argentus' quest felt very underwhelming. There's a doorway to a giant dungeon, presumably, which got me excited because I thought we were going to get a huge combat experience where Argenta could show off her abilities. But all that happens is she goes in by herself, and then we're left to await her return on the ship. It's a really unsatisfying conclusion to a companion's personal quest, and it left me wondering if the devs just ran out of time to implement everything they wanted to put into the game. Everything then concludes with a very brief 5th and final chapter that feels far too short and underwhelming. Fortunately, it ends in a large dungeon with a lot of neat battles, but still, I was pretty disappointed with how short this chapter was. Small spoiler alert here. We end up taking a gate to an uncharted area of the Kronos Expanse, and I got my hopes up thinking we were going to be exploring a host of new systems and uncovering clues about the main plot. But instead, there's only a couple of companion quests and a pair of isolated dungeons that are really small, like 1 encounter each, and then we dive into the final dungeon and it's over. This new region of the galaxy seems like a huge missed opportunity to me, and again I wondered if the devs simply ran out of time and weren't able to add all the content they originally had planned. As I said at the outset, this has been my favorite Owlcat game to play so far. It's easy to see the progress they've made from Kingmaker to Wrath of the Righteous to Rogue Trader. They seem to have learned from prior mistakes and have done a much better job integrating tertiary systems into the core gameplay loop in a way that makes everything fun and interesting. Yes, the game still has some flaws, but after 2 complete playthroughs, I'm happy to say this is far more fun than any of Owlcat's prior titles. Plus, there's new DLC on the way as well. The first DLC, Void Shadows, introduced a new companion and new classes, and it has a fairly satisfying series of quests tied to that new companion. I definitely plan on doing a Let's Play series for this game, and given the 3 ideological paths you can take through the game, dogmatic, heretical, and iconoclast, and how much fun I've had playing it so far, I may actually do more than one series for this game. Anyway, bottom line is that I love this game a lot. So if you're on the fence about it, I definitely encourage you to go play it. If you like tactical turn-based games, if you really enjoy tactical turn-based combat and deep, complex character build systems, this is the game for you. All right, everyone, I'm Colors Fade, and that's it for this video. If you liked it, consider giving the video a like, consider subscribing to my channel, and until next time, happy gaming, everyone.